Vincent had always prided himself on keeping his cargo hauler running smooth as butter, but apparently the universe had other plans. One minute he was cruising through what he thought was neutral space. The next, his engine was coughing like a chain smoker and his navigation system was flashing more warning lights than a carnival. "Well, ain't this just perfect?" he muttered, wrestling with controls that seemed determined to ignore him entirely. The ship shuddered, groaned, and promptly decided it had had enough of this whole flying through space business. Emergency landing protocols kicked in, and Vincent found himself on the surface of some backwater moon that looked about as welcoming as a tax audit. He'd barely had time to pop the hood, so to speak, when the welcoming committee arrived. And by welcoming committee, he meant a squad of 8-foot-tall reptilian nightmares with enough firepower to level a small city. The Nexari Empire, as it turned out, took a rather dim view of uninvited guests. "Trespasser," growled their leader, a walking mountain of scales and bad attitude. "You have violated Nexari sovereign space." Vincent raised his hands, trying to look as non-threatening as possible, which, considering he was barely 6 feet tall and currently covered in engine grease, wasn't exactly difficult. "Look, fellas, this is just a misunderstanding. My ship broke down. I had no idea this was your turf. Silence." The Nexari's voice could have curdled milk. "The penalty for trespass is detention. You will be processed." And that, as they say, was that. Vincent found himself unceremoniously hauled away from his broken ship, through a fortress that looked like it had been designed by someone with serious anger management issues, and down into what could generously be called a detention facility. Less generously, it looked like the kind of place where hope went to die. The guards, each one large enough to bench press a small vehicle, seemed to find his predicament absolutely hilarious. They chattered among themselves in their clicking, hissing language, occasionally pointing at Vincent and making sounds that were probably the Nexari equivalent of snickering. "Oh sure, laugh it up," Vincent said under his breath. "Wait till the insurance company hears about this." They stopped in front of a massive cell door, the kind that could probably withstand a direct hit from a small asteroid. One of the guards operated some kind of control panel, and the door slid open with a sound like doom being unboxed. "Your accommodation," the lead guard announced, and Vincent could swear the bastard was smiling, which, on a Nexari face, looked less like amusement and more like a preview of his own death. Vincent stepped forward, peering into the dimly lit cell, and that's when he noticed two things. First, the cell was significantly larger than he'd expected, more like a small arena than a prison cell. Second, and rather more importantly, there was something moving in the shadows. Make that 3 somethings. "What exactly are you putting me in there with?" Vincent asked, though he had a sinking feeling he already knew the answer. The guard's smile widened, revealing far too many teeth for anyone's comfort. "Huntlings. 3 of them. They have not fed in some time." Oh, well, that explained the size of the cell, and probably the stains on the floor that Vincent really didn't want to think about too hard. "Huntlings," he repeated slowly, "and those would be young ones of our species, predators. They will provide entertainment." The way the guard said entertainment made Vincent's blood run cold. These weren't just tossing him in with some alien equivalent of puppies. They were throwing him to wolves. Baby wolves, maybe, but wolves nonetheless. The guard shoved him forward into the cell, and the door slammed shut behind him with a finality that made his stomach drop. Emergency lighting cast everything in an eerie orange glow, creating shadows that danced and shifted like living things. Vincent stood perfectly still, every instinct screaming at him to run, even though there was nowhere to go. In the far corner of the cell, 3 pairs of eyes reflected the light back at him. They were smaller than the adult Nexari he'd encountered, but smaller was relative when you were talking about creatures that still probably outweighed him by 50 pounds each. The first one emerged from the shadows, and Vincent got his first good look at a Nexari huntling. It was built like a cross between a big cat and a crocodile, with sleek scales that shifted from deep green to black depending on the light. Its claws clicked against the metal floor as it moved, each one long enough to open him up like a can of soup. The second one followed, this one bearing distinctive white stripes across its back and shoulders. Its eyes were intelligent, too intelligent for Vincent's comfort, and fixed on him with predatory focus. The third remained in the shadows for a moment longer before stepping into the light. This one was darker than the others, almost pure black except for a patch of lighter scales on its chest. It was also, Vincent noticed, the largest of the three. "Well," he said quietly, more to himself than to his new roommates, "this is either going to go very badly or very badly with extra steps." The huntlings circled him slowly, and Vincent could practically hear the guards outside placing bets on how long he'd last. Their movements were coordinated, practiced, pack hunters, even at this age. They'd done this before. But as Vincent watched them, something else caught his attention. Their movements, while predatory, seemed sluggish. Their scales, which should have been vibrant and healthy, looked dull. And when the striped one opened its mouth, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth, Vincent noticed something that made his heart sink. They were thin, not just lean, actually malnourished. "Oh, hell," he muttered. "They're not feeding you properly, are they?" The dark one tilted its head at the sound of his voice, a gesture so surprisingly curious that Vincent almost smiled. Almost. He was still very much aware that he was locked in a cage with three predators who could probably tear him apart without breaking a sweat. But hungry predators made mistakes. And right now, looking at these three young hunters, Vincent was starting to think that maybe, just maybe, the Nexari guards had made a very big mistake indeed. Outside the cell, he could hear the guards settling in for what they clearly expected to be a show. Their clicking laughter echoed off the metal walls, and Vincent caught enough of their body language to know they were taking bets on how quickly the huntlings would finish him off. "Sorry to disappoint you, boys," he said under his breath, never taking his eyes off the three creatures still circling him. "But I've got a feeling this isn't going to go quite the way you planned." The largest huntling took a step closer, and Vincent forced himself to remain perfectly still. This was it. The moment of truth. Either he was about to become the galaxy's most expensive chew toy, or he was about to find out if growing up on a ranch dealing with ornery livestock had taught him anything useful about handling dangerous animals. Either way, it was going to be an interesting night. The standoff lasted exactly 38 seconds before Vincent realized something the guards outside had apparently missed. These weren't vicious killers. They were scared kids. Oh, sure, they were scared kids with claws that could slice through steel and jaws that could probably crack his skull like a walnut. But the body language was unmistakable. The way they held themselves low to the ground, the uncertain glances they kept shooting at each other, the fact that despite circling him for several minutes, none of them had actually attacked yet. Vincent had seen the same behavior in abandoned farm dogs back home, hungry, desperate, but not quite sure if the human in front of them was friend or foe. "Easy there," he said softly, slowly lowering himself into a crouch. The movement caused all three huntlings to tense, but they didn't bolt. Good sign. "I know you're hungry. I can see it." The striped one, Vincent was already starting to think of it as Stripe, took a hesitant step forward, nostrils flaring. It was scenting him, trying to figure out what exactly he was and whether he posed a threat. Vincent reached slowly into his jacket pocket, careful not to make any sudden movements. The emergency rations he'd grabbed during the chaos of his capture weren't much, a couple of protein bars and some dried fruit. But it was better than nothing. "Here's the thing about being the alpha," he said conversationally, unwrapping one of the protein bars with deliberate care. "It's not about being the biggest or the meanest, it's about providing. For the pack." He broke off a piece of the protein bar and tossed it gently toward Stripe. The huntling jumped back as if he'd thrown a grenade, but after a moment of careful consideration, crept forward to sniff the offering. Outside the cell, the guards' chuckling had died down. Vincent could feel them watching, probably confused by the lack of screaming and dismemberment. Stripe picked up the piece of protein bar with surprising delicacy, considering those claws, and swallowed it whole. The reaction was immediate. The young predator's head shot up, eyes wide with what Vincent could only describe as shock. Apparently, actual food was a novelty in this place. "Yeah, that's real protein," Vincent said, breaking off another piece. "Not whatever garbage they've been feeding you." This time he made Stripe come closer to get it. The huntling hesitated, clearly torn between hunger and caution, but eventually crept forward until it was close enough for Vincent to see the intelligence burning in those reptilian eyes. The other two were watching intently now. Vincent could practically see the wheels turning in their heads. This strange creature had food, real food, and was willing to share it. That put him in a very interesting position in their social hierarchy. "That's right," Vincent murmured as Stripe carefully took the second piece from his hand. "I'm the one with the resources, which makes me—" He didn't finish the sentence, but he could see understanding dawning in the huntling's expression. Pack dynamics were apparently universal. The patch-chested one, Patch, Vincent decided, made a soft sound that was almost like a whine. It was edging closer, clearly wanting food but unsure of the protocol. "Your turn," Vincent said, producing another protein bar. But this time, instead of immediately offering food, he held up one hand in a clear stop gesture. "Sit." Patch tilted its head, confused. Vincent repeated the gesture, his voice firm but not aggressive. "Sit." It took 3 tries, but eventually Patch seemed to get the idea and lowered its hindquarters to the floor. Vincent immediately tossed it a piece of protein bar, accompanied by what he hoped was encouraging body language. "Good," he said, and meant it. "Very good." The darkest one, Midnight, was still hanging back, watching the proceedings with what Vincent was beginning to recognize as calculating intelligence. This one was the thinker of the group, probably the most dangerous, but also potentially the most useful. Vincent stood slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. All 3 huntlings tensed, but none of them backed away. Progress. "Here's what I think happened," he said, addressing Midnight directly. "Your handlers figured 3 young predators would make short work of one soft human. What they didn't account for was the fact that you 3 have been systematically starved and probably mistreated. Am I right?" Midnight's head tilted, slightly, and Vincent could swear the creature was actually listening to his words, not just his tone. "See, back where I come from, we've got a saying. A hungry dog is a loyal dog, but a starved dog is a desperate dog, and desperate animals don't think straight." Vincent broke off another piece of protein bar, but this time he held it up where all 3 could see it. "But well-fed animals? They remember who takes care of them." Outside the cell, he could hear the guards starting to mutter among themselves. Their entertainment wasn't going according to plan, and they were clearly getting restless. Vincent decided to push his luck. He walked, slowly, carefully, to the center of the cell and sat down cross-legged on the floor. It was about the most vulnerable position he could adopt, and if he'd miscalculated, he was about to become a very expensive mistake. Instead, all 3 huntlings moved closer, not quite within arm's reach, but close enough that Vincent could see the curiosity warring with instinct in their expressions. "My name's Vincent," he said quietly. "I'm not sure what yours are, or if you even have names, but I'm going to call you Stripe, Patch, and Midnight. Is that okay with you?" Stripe made a soft sound that might have been agreement, or indigestion. Hard to tell with alien predators. Vincent pulled out the last of his rations, the dried fruit, and divided it into 3 equal portions. But instead of just handing it out, he set the portions on the floor in front of him and waited. "If you want it, you come and get it, but we do this civilized-like." It was Patch who made the first move, creeping forward on its belly until it could snatch one of the portions and retreat to a safe distance. Stripe followed, moving with more confidence, and finally midnight approached. But midnight didn't just grab the food and run. Instead, the dark huntling settled down just a few feet away from Vincent, close enough that he could see the scars along its flanks, evidence of rough treatment from the guards. "Yeah," Vincent said softly. "I figured as much. They've been using pain to control you, haven't they? Probably electric prods or something similar." Midnight's eyes narrowed, and Vincent took that as confirmation. "Well, here's the thing about pain-based training," he continued, his voice taking on a harder edge. "It works in the short term, but it builds resentment, and resentment is something you can work with." He glanced toward the cell door, where he could see the silhouettes of the guards through the small observation window. They were getting agitated now, clearly unhappy with the lack of bloodshed. "How about we give them something to really worry about?" Vincent suggested. As if on cue, one of the guards activated some kind of intercom system. The voice that crackled through was the same one that had thrown Vincent into the cell in the first place. "Human, you will move away from the huntlings immediately." Vincent looked up at the speaker mounted near the ceiling and gave it his most pleasant smile. "Or what? You'll throw me in a cell with dangerous predators?" There was a pause, then angry clicking sounds that Vincent was pretty sure translated to some very colorful profanity. "The huntlings have not fed in 3 days," the guard snarled. "Soon they will overcome their curiosity and remember their hunger." 3 days? Vincent's voice went cold. "You haven't fed them in 3 days?" He stood up, and this time his movement was anything but careful. The huntlings tensed, but they didn't back away. If anything, they seemed to sense his anger and approved of it. "That's not training," Vincent said, his voice carrying clearly to the intercom. "That's cruelty, and cruelty, my friend, has a way of coming back to bite you." The guard's response was to activate what was obviously some kind of punishment system. Electric current arced across the walls of the cell, designed to drive the huntlings into a frenzy. Instead, all 3 young predators moved closer to Vincent, instinctively seeking protection from the source of food and safety they'd identified. "Bad move," Vincent said calmly, as Stripe actually pressed against his leg, scales warm through the fabric of his pants. "Very bad move." The electricity stopped, but the damage was done. The huntlings were no longer looking at Vincent as potential prey. They were looking at the guards outside as threats to their newfound pack leader. And Vincent was starting to smile. "Boys," he said conversationally, "I think it's time we had a little chat with management. The morning shift change brought new entertainment for the guards, though not quite the kind they'd been expecting. Instead of finding scattered human remains and 3 satisfied huntlings, they discovered Vincent sitting calmly in the center of the cell with all 3 predators arranged around him like some kind of bizarre honor guard. Commander Calthex arrived within the hour, his heavy footsteps echoing through the detention block like approaching thunder. Vincent had been wondering when the big boss would show up. Yesterday's lack of screaming and dying had probably generated some uncomfortable questions. "Explain this," Calthex demanded, staring through the reinforced observation window at the scene inside the cell. The duty guard, a nervous creature who kept shifting his weight from foot to foot, cleared his throat uncertainly. "The human has not been consumed, Commander. Instead, he appears to have bonded with the huntlings." "Bonded?" Calthex's voice could have frozen helium. "Huntlings do not bond with prey species." "Yes, Commander. However, observation suggests otherwise." As if to prove the point, Stripe chose that moment to rest its massive head on Vincent's shoulder, a gesture that would have been touching if not for the rows of razor teeth visible in the creature's slightly open mouth. Vincent waved cheerfully at the window. "Morning, Commander. Hope you slept well. Your hospitality has been educational." Calthex's scales darkened, which, Vincent had learned from observing the guards, was not a good sign. "You will explain how you have accomplished this impossibility." "Oh, that's easy," Vincent said, gently scratching behind Stripe's ear ridge. The huntling made a sound that was suspiciously like purring. Turns out your people don't know much about proper animal husbandry. These three were half-starved and scared out of their minds. Amazing what a little food and basic kindness can accomplish. The commander's expression suggested he was considering several violent responses to this observation. Huntlings are weapons. They are trained through discipline and hunger. Yeah, well, your training methods stink, Vincent replied bluntly. Literally, in some cases. When's the last time anyone cleaned this cell properly? Calthex turned to the nervous guard. Release 3 adult warriors into the containment area. This aberration ends now. Vincent felt midnight tense beside him, and Patch let out a low growl that made the observation window vibrate. Apparently, the Huntlings had excellent hearing and an even better understanding of Nexari military protocol. Commander, the guard said hesitantly, are you certain that's wise? The Huntlings appear to be protecting the human. They are juveniles, Calthex snapped. 3 adults will remind them of their proper place in the hierarchy. Vincent stood up, and all 3 Huntlings rose with him. The synchronization was unnerving. They moved like extensions of his will, responding to subtle cues he wasn't even aware he was giving. You sure about this? Vincent asked mildly. Because I've got a feeling your boys out there aren't going to like what happens next. 10 minutes later, the cell door opened with its characteristic sound of impending doom. 3 adult Nexari warriors entered, each one armed with what looked like electrified batons and enough confidence to conquer a small planet. The first warrior, a scarred veteran with missing scales along his left arm, sneered at Vincent. Step away from the Huntlings, human. Your entertainment value has expired. Vincent didn't move. Actually, I think I'm comfortable right where I am. The warrior raised his baton, electricity crackling along its length. Then you will be removed. That's when Stripe attacked. The young Huntling moved faster than Vincent's eyes could follow, crossing the distance to the warrior in a single bound. The adult Nexari had perhaps half a second to register surprise before 50 pounds of scales, claws, and fury slammed into his chest. The baton went flying as the warrior crashed to the ground. Stripe's jaws clamped around his throat in a grip that stopped just short of actually crushing his windpipe. A warning, not an execution. Though Vincent doubted the distinction mattered much to the warrior, currently contemplating his mortality. The second warrior moved to help his colleague, only to find his path blocked by Patch, who had somehow gotten behind him without anyone noticing. The Huntling's claws were extended, and its head was lowered in a classic attack posture. The third warrior, showing more sense than his companions, stayed exactly where he was and very carefully set his baton on the floor. Smart man, Vincent said approvingly. Then, to his Huntlings, easy boys. We're making a point, not starting a war. Stripe released the first warrior, who scrambled backward until he hit the cell wall. Patch maintained his threatening stance but didn't attack. All 3 Huntlings looked to Vincent for guidance. Commander Calthex was staring through the observation window with an expression that suggested his worldview was undergoing some serious structural damage. How? He demanded through the intercom. Vincent shrugged. Pack dynamics. These 3 recognized me as Alpha when I provided food and protection. Now they'll defend me against threats, including threats from your people. That is impossible. Nexari do not submit to alien authority. Yeah, well, apparently your intel was a little off. Vincent gestured to the 3 warriors, who were now huddled together near the door like children afraid of the dark. Want to try sending in more soldiers? Because I've got to tell you, this is the most entertainment I've had in years. There was a long pause as Calthex processed this development. Vincent could practically hear the gears turning in the commander's head, weighing options and calculating possibilities. You have corrupted them, Calthex said finally. Made them weak. Have I? Vincent asked. Because from where I'm standing, they look like they just took down 3 adult warriors without breaking a sweat. That's not weak, Commander. That's efficient. More silence. Then, what do you want? Vincent smiled. Now they were getting somewhere. Well, for starters, I want these 3 properly fed and cared for. Real food, clean water, adequate exercise. The basics. And in return, you get to see what properly motivated huntlings can really do. Think about it, Commander. You've been trying to break their spirits to make them obedient. But what if you channeled their natural abilities instead? What if you worked with their instincts instead of against them? Through the observation window, Vincent could see other Nexari officers gathering, drawn by reports of the unprecedented situation in Detention Block 5. Word was spreading fast through the facility. You speak of military applications, Kalthex said slowly. I speak of potential, Vincent corrected. These three aren't just weapons, they're intelligence assets. They can think, plan, adapt, but only if you stop treating them like mindless beasts. One of the officers outside, a smaller Nexari with elaborate rank insignia, leaned close to Kalthex and whispered something urgent. The commander's expression darkened further. It appears, Kalthex said coldly, that word of this situation has reached the High Command. They are interested in observing your methods firsthand. Vincent felt a chill run down his spine. Whatever was coming next, it was bigger than a simple prison break. The Nexari military apparatus was taking notice, and that could be either very good or very bad for his long-term life expectancy. When? He asked. They arrive at midday. You will demonstrate your control over the huntlings for their evaluation. Vincent looked down at Stripe, who was still watching the cowed warriors with predatory interest. What happens if they don't like what they see? Kalthex's smile was all teeth and no warmth. Then you and your pack will be eliminated as a security threat. And if they do like it, then perhaps we will discuss more permanent arrangements. Vincent nodded slowly. He'd bought himself time, but the price was going to be a performance that could determine not just his fate, but the fate of three young creatures who had trusted him with their lives. Fair enough, he said, but I'm going to need those improvements to their conditions implemented immediately. Hungry soldiers don't perform at their best. Kalthex stared at him for a long moment, then barked orders to the guards. Within minutes, food and water were being delivered to the cell. Real food, not the slop the huntlings had been subsisting on. As Vincent watched his three companions eat their first proper meal in who knows how long, he couldn't help but wonder what exactly he'd gotten himself into. The Nexari High Command didn't strike him as the type to be impressed by parlor tricks. But then again, he thought, as Midnight looked up from its meal and made that soft sound that might have been gratitude, they'd probably never seen anything quite like this before. Time to find out if humanity's gift for the impossible extended to interspecies diplomacy. The High Command arrived with enough pomp and circumstance to invade a small planet. 3 admirals, 2 generals, and what Vincent could only assume was the Nexari equivalent of a supreme overlord, a massive creature whose scales had gone silver with age, and whose presence made even Kalthex look nervous. Demonstrate, the overlord commanded without preamble. Vincent stood, and his 3 companions rose with him in perfect synchronization. What would you like to see? Combat effectiveness. Vincent nodded to Midnight, who immediately vanished into the shadows at the far end of the cell. Stripe and Patch took flanking positions, moving with the fluid coordination of a unit that had trained together for months instead of hours. Release 6 warriors, Vincent called out, armed. Even Kalthex looked surprised. 6? That seems excessive, Vincent smiled. Trust me. The warriors entered confident and left on stretchers. The huntlings moved like liquid death, striking from shadows and blind spots, using terrain and teamwork in ways that defied their youth. Not one warrior landed a blow. The Overlord's eyes never left Vincent. Remarkable. They respond to your will without verbal commands. Body language, scent markers, micro-expressions. We've developed our own communication system. And their loyalty? Vincent walked to the cell door, which opened at his approach. The huntlings flanked him as he stepped into the corridor, facing a dozen armed guards. Not one Nexari moved to stop him. Absolute, Vincent said simply. The overlord studied him for a long moment. We have a proposition. Join our military as a pack leader. Train others in your methods. In exchange, formal recognition of humanity as an allied species. Vincent looked down at his three companions, who were watching him with intelligent eyes that held something very much like affection. Gentlemen, he said, I think we have a deal. Behind them, Calthex was frantically taking notes, probably wondering how he'd explain this to his superiors. Some days, Vincent reflected, the universe had a sense of humor after all.